Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Nina Banks. Nina is an associate professor of economics at Bucknell University and a current president of National Economic Association. And today we will speak about her book, Democracy, Race, and Justice, the speeches and writing of Sadie T. Alexander. Nina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ellen, for having me on your show, on your podcast.
So Nina, before you are also an economist, and you are covering the life of Sadie Alexander, who is the first Black female economist in the United States. So I wonder if we could start with your own background. What is it that drove you toward economics?
Oh, wow. I studied economics, sociology, and history when I was an undergraduate. And both or all three of those fields were really fascinating. But I had an econ professor who really made economics come alive because he focused on contending issues. His name was Joseph Doms. He was a heterodox economist, so he wasn't a mainstream economist. And so he was very persistent. He kept encouraging me to take econ classes, which I did. And I ultimately decided to go into economics to get a doctorate degree rather than sociology or history, because there are so few African-American economists. And I hoped that I could make, a dent in the profession of economics. So that is probably why I went into it. I was interested in issues of economic development, studied development economics. And as it was, finish my classes and time to write a dissertation or to start thinking about a dissertation, what I realized is that I really wanted to do work that focused on something that was important to me, African-American women and work. And it's not a subject that is talked about much in economics, especially the history of African-American women in work. So I ended up doing a non-conventional dissertation in economics that included archival research. That was the basis for my dissertation, a deep immersion into an archives at the University of Pittsburgh. I got my doctorate from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And I focused on African-American women who were migrating from the South into the North, into Pittsburgh, and they were domestic servants. And so got my doctorate in 1999 and have been an academic economist ever since.
And you mentioned that there were few African-American economies, but how few is it today? And how few is it female, and how few, even worse, female African-American economies?
Yeah, I don't have data on the top, at the top of my head to give you, but it's very small. It's been consistent in terms of Black, right? Because it includes people who are not African-American, but who are permanent residents in the United States or who've gained citizenship. So I would say that the percentage of Black economists has hovered around, in the US, 3% or so.
Wow.
Even since the time when I was a graduate student, maybe a little bit under 3%, and less than 1% of economists in the US are Black women. And that has really been consistent since I was a graduate student. The numbers have not improved. I don't know if they've worsened, but they certainly have not improved over time.
And is it because of structural challenges or because of lack of interest of Black Americans, female in economics?
Lack of interest. I think that when we see Black students who are studying economics at the undergraduate level and then ended up going on to get doctorate degrees, increasingly it is immigrant Black people, because they are interested in the topic of economic development, which actually was what I was also interested in. There are very few other disciplines really that cover economic development as thoroughly as economics. But when it comes to African Americans, there are lots of competing disciplines that do a much, I think, better job of talking about issues, issues that are relevant to the African American experience. And so, at predominantly white institutions, for example, we tend to see African American students taking Africana studies courses because they are taking courses that are interesting, that are relevant to their histories, their lives. So I really think that it's an issue of interest, not a reflection on Black students and African American students, but a reflection on the lack of appeal of the courses that introduce economics to students. Our principles of econ courses tend to be very abstract, and they tend to not include much information on African Americans or Black Americans. And when they do present information on economic outcomes, they often don't include it within a historical context to explain why there are worse economic outcomes. So I think that it's largely an issue tied to the curriculum at the undergraduate level. When we fix that problem, which is a huge problem, then we'll start to see an increase in the number of Black economists and brown economists.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit before we move on to the topic of the book about your current work on social reproduction and migrant household, or Black woman and work.
Yeah, so I have consistently looked at Black women and work since the dissertation phase. And it, as I said, is an understudied topic in economics, which to me is really an outrage because African American women have been, I would say, the most important women workers in our economy historically, going back to the period of slavery. But during the 19th century, African American women had much higher rates of labor force participation than other groups of women, whether they were married or single. And today, African American women are much more likely to be, breadwinners or co-breadwinners in their households. So to me, I think it's outrageous that the profession has not looked at African American women and work more centrally. The work that I've been doing over the last few years in terms of African American women and work is really extending the feminist focus on unpaid work beyond the household realm to look at the history of work that Black and brown women have been performing, which is not just unpaid and non-market work, but it also takes place collectively. And so what I've been arguing is that as feminists, we've been looking at non-market unpaid work that women are performing within the household and arguing that that needs to be recognized as important work, quantified, and assess a value to it. And I'm saying that we should be doing that for the unpaid non-market work that Black and brown women historically disproportionately perform for their communities as well. That is also work that we've been thinking of only as activism, political activism, and overlooking this activity as actual work. So there's a long tendency to not see the work that Black women and brown women are doing and to recognize it as work.
And when you see recognize, do you mean recognize socially or recognize in the GDP, gross domestic product, or both?
It's tricky. And so I'm talking about it, recognizing it socially and recognizing it that it takes place, that it's really important, that it's taking place in these communities because Black women are organizing around unmet needs and also threats and harms to their communities. That's what motivates Black women to engage in collective action that involves unpaid work. Now, when we look at unpaid household work, there is an attempt to quantify it and look at the value to GDP. But for the work that Black and brown women are doing, it's really motivated by disparities, racial and ethnic disparities. And so it's not, I would say that it's not adding value to our national output because it develops in response to something that is negative. So we would need an alternative way of measuring it. Genuine progress indicator, for example, that actually would subtract it from the value of national output because it is a negative.
Wow.
Right. These are activities that the state should provide, for example.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
For the
So
private
that's
sector.
thank you for giving us all that information about your work. Okay. So now my question is, how do you stumble upon Sadie T. Alexander? What is it that say, okay, I'm going to do a research about Sadie and I'm going to publish a book about it?
Yeah, long time coming. First heard about her as a graduate student. Good friend Gina Beavers in history showed me a volume back here, Black Women in America, 2-volume. Darlene Clark Heim published it. And it included an entry on Sadie Alexander as the first African-American woman economist. Had never heard of her. Years later, I was teaching a course and on African-American feminist thought. There was an anthology that included the one economic article that Sadie Alexander published. She published it for the National Urban League's Opportunity magazine. And it really spoke to me as a budding feminist economist because she was talking about things that feminist economists of my generation were thinking about, right? So 70 years later. And I read a few years later an article by economist Julianne Malveaux that talked about really the tragic loss to the economics profession and the nation from not having Sadie Alexander's economic thought included. Sadie Alexander was born in 1898 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, into prominent African-American families. And when in 1921, she received her doctorate degree in economics. 2 other African-American women that year also received doctorate degrees. And that was the first time in our history that African-American women received the doctorate degrees. But no institution, Black, white, hired any of those 3 women that year into positions that were commensurate with their doctorate levels. So when I was a junior faculty member, 2003, all of those factors motivated me to try to figure out, to go to the archives at the University of Pennsylvania where Sadie Alexander's records are stored. Her family had donated the records in 1987, 2 years before she died. And so I wanted to see, if there was something that suggested that she had continued to have an interest in economics, because the general thinking at the time, 2003, is that once she wasn't able to become employed as an economist, went back to the University of Pennsylvania and became a lawyer in 1927 and had a remarkable career as an attorney. The thinking was that she had given up her interest in economics, understandably. And so I was really motivated by the desire to find out, was she still thinking about economics? Can I piece something together, to reconstruct her economic thought so that I could restore her intellectual thought to the profession? That was really what motivated me.
Okay, I wonder, so she graduated, she got her PhD diploma in 1921, and I can understand why some white institution wouldn't hire her, but why wouldn't a Black institution hire her as well?
Yeah, I mean, and so that for me, that is the key issue and the way that we should be thinking about what happened to not just Sadie Alexander in 1921, but all 3 of the African-American women who received doctorate degrees. Typically, the discussion of Sadie Alexander is framed around the economics profession, which certainly was racist then, is racist now. But the problem was bigger than the economics profession. And so Black women were facing discrimination based on the intersection of race and gender. And that's something that Black men and white women and white men right, we're not dealing with. So that was the problem, coming not just from white institutions, not just from women's colleges, but Black institutions. Black men with doctorates could get hired at Black institutions, white women with doctorates at women's colleges. Black women couldn't.
Okay, 1921, the year that she graduated, is still a year where there is a lot of racism. I wonder what were the circumstances that she had to face in order to, number one, to afford her education, and secondly, to graduate.
Yeah, good question. So her social class position was more economically privileged. Her grandfather was a bishop, Benjamin Tanner, in the AME Church. And Sadie Alexander's father, Aaron Mossell Jr., was the first African-American to get a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He left his family when she was just a baby. And so she ended up growing up in a household without her father, but still having access to privileges, economic privileges, because of the because of who her grandfather was. Her mother wanted her to attend the University of Pennsylvania because of the family ties to Penn. She wanted to attend Howard University. She grew up living between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. But she went to the University of Pennsylvania, relied on her grandfather to finance her undergraduate education. And when she was a graduate student, she entered into a master's program in 1918 in history, and then switched into economics. But she always had funding. She had scholarships or fellowships, whatever you want to call them. And she also had the support of her economic faculty, and also trying to ensure that her research, that she had funding to do the research, and funding to publish it as well. So she had financial support.
Okay, great. But how how did she manage to overcome the racism of the era as well?
I don't think she overcame it.
I
Right?
see.
She
Yeah.
didn't overcome it
Right.
because so those three Black women who received doctorate degrees, 1921, Eva Dykes, Georgiana Simpson, Sadie Mossell, and the other two were in the humanities, in Georgiana Simpson in German and Eva Dykes in English. Those two other women ended up going to Washington, D.C. and working at Dunbar High School. Very prestigious all-Black high school. It was the renamed from the M Street High School, which is where Sadie Alexander had gone to high school. So they were able to get jobs as high school teachers in 1921, not as professors. Sadie Alexander wasn't able to even get a job as a high school teacher when she returned to Philadelphia. So she got her doctorate in 21, couldn't get a job as an economist, ends up going to work in North Carolina for North Carolina Mutual, which was the largest Black insurance company in the country, and then returned in 1923 to Philadelphia to marry Raymond Pace Alexander after he completed his doctorate degree at Harvard. But she could not even get a job as a high school teacher in Philadelphia because of discrimination against Black women. White women, women who had less education, could get hired at the level of high school, but Black women with more education, such as Sadie Alexander, could not.
Right.
She
Eventually,
didn't overcome it.
yeah, eventually, Black women somewhere in the country, I don't know where, were able to get jobs as professors in other universities. When would that happen?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not a question that I have looked into.
Right. Okay. Okay. It's just that she couldn't get a job in Philadelphia in 1923. Eventually, that must have happened somewhere in the country. It just didn't happen in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I don't know when the first Black women were hired as professors. I know that Howard University hired Eva Dykes in 1929 as a professor, and
Wow.
then they ended, you're right, so her doctorate degree was 1921. Howard hired her as a professor in 1929, and then they hired Georgiana Simpson in I think it was 1931.
Wow. Wow.
She was older, by the way, because she
Yes,
got her
yes.
doctorate degree when she was middle age. I can't imagine getting a doctorate degree in middle age. Anyway, she got it in middle age and then started her professorship when she was older.
Right. Okay.
um, yeah, so I know those dates, but if there was, what happened in between, I don't know.
Okay. Well, even as an attorney, she is. I mean, the thesis of your book is that even as an attorney, she continued contributing to the economics field throughout her life. Can you share some of the contributions of her work?
Yeah, so when I started doing archival research 2003, I was really shocked to discover that, that it wasn't the case that she had moved away from thinking about, economic issues, that she had actually spent her life focused on big issues that were confronting the African-American community. And so her dissertation, of course, focused on the Great Migration of African-Americans from the South to the North, becomes an attorney, and then continues to have a lifelong engagement with economic issues tied to the treatment and the mistreatment of African Americans. 1920s, she was focused on issues of inclusion of African Americans into the growing industrial sector. 1930s, she became very critical of government policies that had a disparate impact on African Americans, the New Deal policies, which she had hoped would lead to an improvement in the position of African Americans in a way that had not happened since the period of Reconstruction, when Black men had gained office in the South. But of course, New Deal policies excluded the major occupations where African Americans worked. And so her fears were realized that African Americans would end up being in a worse position. 1940s is really important because in the 1940s, she observed the benefits of government policies to bring about full employment through direct job creation, those public works programs. In 1944, President Roosevelt had a State of the Union address where he called for a second Bill of Rights and argued that because of changes in the US economy since the country's founding, that we needed to have a second Bill of Rights that included the right to a job. And so Sadie Alexander picked up on that, I believe, the next year and gave a speech, 1945, at Florida A&M, where she called for full employment through government job guarantees. So, and when I found that, what I realized is that Sadie Alexander then was the first African-American economist to propose federal job guarantees. And then in the 1960s, she was supportive not just of the civil rights movement, but also very supportive of Black protest that was taking place throughout the country, but especially in urban areas against racial injustices, and believed that it was the single greatest moral issue of the century. So, when I discovered that she had given these speeches, what I ended up doing is reconstructing her intellectual thought through those speeches. Some were handwritten, some were typed, but they needed a lot of work in terms of interpreting them, deciphering them, reconstructing them. And along the way, realized that Sadie Alexander was not just the first Black woman economist in the US, that she was also the first African-American economist. When I started doing the research, the thinking was that George Edmund Haynes was the first African-American economist. There was a paper that came out in 1990 that made that point. So we thought that Sadie Alexander was just the first African-American woman. And I realized by doing some more research on George Edmund Haynes that he was not an economist. So Sadie Alexander was the first. Also the first economist to propose a federal job guarantee. But what I also found that is remarkable about her body of thought is that she was also the only economist in the country who lived through the major episodes, the major defining episodes for African Americans throughout the 20th century, who not only lived through it, but also chronicled those experiences. So her intellectual thought is remarkable because it demonstrates her compassion, her morality, her brilliance, but it also documents the political economic history of African Americans through most of the 20th century.
The one thing that made me sad is that this is from long time ago. All her photos are black and white, if we can think that far into the past, but all these issues are still relevant today. I mean, there's still discriminations, there's still objectivity of woman. There is almost everything that she has been fighting for since the 20s is still, the United States is still fighting the same battles to a different degree, but I mean, all her work is relevant today.
Yes, absolutely. It's and it goes beyond economics. So the last part of the book focuses on democracy and citizenship rights, and she's making forceful arguments that African Americans need to share fully in the benefits of the rights of citizenship and, economic prosperity that their labor created for the nation. But she talks about issues tied to jury selection. We're still dealing with this nonsense today in the United States where juries are all white or nearly all white. Over policing was a concern. Police harassment, unwarranted searches and seizures, all of the issues, the economic marginalization of Black people and brown people in our economy, persistent employment discrimination of Black workers, on and on and on. So her analysis is also very much an analysis of structural or systemic racism. And you're right, it is still ongoing. And the other thing that I think is really tragic, when I read through Sadie Alexander's speeches, is that discrimination costs not just individuals in terms of their ability to pursue their interest and develop to their potential. We see that with Sadie Alexander. But it takes a tremendous toll on our society as well, because we aren't benefiting from all of the talents that are available, and we aren't benefiting from our greatest minds, such as Sadie Alexander. Think of where we would be perhaps as a nation today if we had the benefit of Sadie Alexander's economic thought shaping public policy.
Wow. When I was informing myself about Sadie Alexander, I saw your name all over the place. Obviously, you have been working on this for a long time. I wonder if anybody else have been working on the resurrection of her memories and her work.
I'm sorry, have anybody else has been working on
the resurrection of her work? And because when I
yes.
see footnotes, I see your name all over the place.
Yeah. Oh no. And I was inspired. So Julianne Malveaux is the economist who published Missed Opportunity in 1991. Missed Opportunity, Sadie Tanner Marcel Alexander and the Economics Profession. She did research on Sadie Alexander's dissertation. And that really motivated me to do this immersion into her archival research. But in the legal field, there is Leah Epperson and Kenneth Mack, and historian Francille Ruchon Wilson has also done work on Sadie Alexander's life as a professional African-American woman. And so their work also motivated my research, right? Because it focused on other aspects of Sadie Alexander's life as a civil rights activist, as a Black professional woman. And then, mine is the piece that deals with this unseen life as an economist, and then the recovery of her intellectual thought, which I think is really exciting.
Well, I'm sure there are going to be thousands of readers thanking you for your contribution. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow the work that you do?
Thank you. The book is titled Democracy, Race, and Justice, The Speeches and Writings of Sadie T. M. Alexander. We published it, it's published with Yale University Press, and we published it on the 100th anniversary to the day, and I even think it covered the hour of when she received her doctorate degree in 1921. And, and we did that because it symbolically reclaims her and brings her back into the field of economics, I think in a really powerful way. David Card, by the way, who just received the Nobel in econ, president of the American Economic Association, also participated in the book launch on June 15th, as did 3 generations of Sadie Alexander's family. So that was really, really exciting. And I'm writing a biography of Sadie Alexander's extraordinary life, also with Yale University Press. So you can find it at Yale University Press, bookstores, online, at the typical sites where we get books as well.
And I follow you on Twitter. Is there any other place where people can follow you?
I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay, okay.
I'm on LinkedIn, but I think Twitter is probably
Okay,
the best
perfect.
site.
I will put all those links in the website. Nina, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a